All right, let's take our Bibles this morning, turn to Proverbs chapter number 15, and we're continuing our series through the book of Proverbs. As I mentioned earlier, once we get into some material that's going to be very repetitive, I'm going to go ahead and skip over that if we've already covered it. For some reason, I haven't gotten to anything worth skipping over yet, though, and so we're going to continue just about a verse by verse here. Proverbs chapter number 15, beginning verse number 1, the Bible there says, "A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. The tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright, but the mouth of fools poureth out foolishness. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. A wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness therein is a breach in the spirit. A fool despiseth his father's instruction, but he that regardeth reproof is prudent. In the house of the righteous is much treasure, but in the revenues of the wicked is trouble. The lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of the foolish doeth not so. The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight." I want to bring a message this morning on the subject, things to avoid like the plague. Once in a great while, the world witnesses what happens when a talented genius appears on the scene. But instead of wanting to promote themselves and bask in the spotlight, they actually run from it. Mo Norman is a Canadian golfer who was viewed by the golfing world as being the best ball striker ever. He was legendary for being able to hit a perfect shot each and every time. It never faded to the right or the left. Every shot was as straight as an arrow. When Tiger Woods was at his peak, he mentioned two golfers that had a unique but deadly golf swing. One was Ben Hogan, and the other was Mo Norman. His consistency at hitting a straight shot nearly every time earned him the nickname Pipeline Mo. So if Mo Norman was so good, why have most of us never heard of him before? The reason was because he was a recluse. He didn't like to be around crowds, didn't like to be around people. He wasn't shy. He was horrified being around other individuals. There was one golf tournament that he won, but he went down by the creek bed and was hiding from everybody because he did not want to accept the trophy. This guy was kind of a nut job. He was from Canada, but he hated to travel outside of Canada. And so he rarely ever played in a PGA tournament, which is why we never heard much of him. He never had a golf lesson in his life. He was totally self-taught, which means his golf swing was his own creation, and throughout his golf career, he liked to do it his way. In one tournament, he had a caddy, and the caddy told him, "Okay, you can get to the green with a driver and a 9-iron. Mo didn't like to be told what to do. And so he teed off with a 9-iron, and then he hit it onto the green with the driver. Just to be different. I mean, this guy definitely marched to a different tune. Howard Hughes shared the same kind of unusual behavior as Mo Norman. He was talented with money and became the richest man in the world. He was talented as a movie producer, and I think it was either in his first or second movie ever produced that he won an Academy Award for it. He was talented as a pilot, and he broke speed records. He was talented as an aircraft designer and designed and built the largest plane in the world called the Spruce Goose. And if anybody told him that it could not be done, he did it just to prove him wrong. But along with that undeniable talent was a desire to avoid things like people and germs. He lived out the last part of his life as a total recluse. He never took a bath. He ate Oreo cookies constantly, but of course that's more normal. He never cut his hair, or his beard, or his fingernails, or his toenails. Being a recluse is not viewed as being normal behavior, and yet that's exactly what Solomon is encouraging us to do if we are to have a great life. There are things that we have to avoid like the plague. And if we're willing to listen to him, we'll find ourselves enjoying life so much more than that individual who's willing to cuddle up to all of the wrong things. Let's take a look here, verse number 1. A soft answer here is what we're going to be taking a look at. First thing this morning is this: we need to avoid needless battles. A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. There are some battles that are worth fighting. Doesn't matter if you're going to win or lose. There are some battles that have to be fought. They must be. When Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as the president of this country, southern states made good their promise to secede from the Union. And that's not what Lincoln wanted. And yet when Fort Sumter was fired upon, that first shot of the Civil War, Lincoln was ready to go to any length, pay any cost, and make any sacrifice to fight for the preservation of the Union. When Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese on December the 7th, 1941, it was an event that single-handedly pulled our nation into a war that we were not ready for. And yet it was a war that left us with no other option but to fight. It is on this same level that I have placed this church. I have placed the King James Bible issue. This is an arena where there is no compromise, there is no surrender, there is no option other than fighting for as long as it takes or as long as we can. And then there are all of the other battles in life that could be fought, but for what reason? Where I park at Walmart is not worth getting into a fight over. If somebody cuts me off on the road, it's not enjoyable, but it's not a fight worth fighting for. I've been ripped off, lied to, lied about, and the unpleasant truth of the matter is that this is a part of being alive in this world, for this world is controlled by Satan, and most of the world is lost. So what should we expect? So what does that leave us with? Solomon's advice is to learn how to give a soft answer. Too many people go through life looking for a fight. And if they can't find one, then they'll start one. So what are our options when we find ourselves being pushed into a confrontation that is explosive and has the potential to get very, very ugly? Politicians call it diplomacy. The military calls it diffusing the situation. Solomon calls it a soft answer. And while it might not be as much fun as lashing out, it saves everybody a lot of pain and a lot of trouble by avoiding a battle that is totally, totally meaningless. A soft answer will convey the notion that you're not wanting to fight. And one reason why it is so effective is because to give a soft answer, that requires humility. Proverbs 13:10 says, "Only by pride cometh contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom." A soft answer is not going to be sarcastic. It will not be insulting. It won't be rude. It will be disarming. It will be gentle, and it'll be marked by humility instead of by pride. A second reason why a soft answer, it works so well, is because it's pleasing to God. And anytime we go out of our way and avoid what the flesh wants to do, and we do that which is pleasing to God, God is going to then bless whatever it was that we just did. God will bless a soft answer simply because it is an act of obedience on our part. Avoid needless battles like the plague. Verse number 3, second thing this morning is this: we need to avoid foolish battles. It says here in verse 3, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. So what's the difference between a needless battle and a foolish battle? Because there is a huge, huge difference. A needless battle is usually a very tempting one because it's usually one that we can tell whether we're going to win or lose. And we like to win. And because we like to win, that's why we'll engage in an argument that we're pretty confident that we're going to win. Doesn't matter how we treat the other person. Doesn't matter how they feel. If it's any kind of a battle and we think that we can win it, we'll usually fight it, even though it's needless. Some people like those needless battles because they're enjoyable in the flesh. A lot of people like them because they enjoy getting into arguments and they kind of relish the idea of hurting somebody. The problem is they're not accomplishing anything. And even though we might win, the question is, why bother when the whole issue is totally irrelevant? A foolish battle, on the other hand, is one that you cannot win. Needless, we like them because we usually pick the ones that we can win. But a foolish battle is one that you are a spiritual idiot to even get yourself involved in this. If North Korea continues to fire missiles pointed at the United States or our allies, they will be very quickly involved in a foolish war. So what does Solomon have to say about foolish battles? He is warning us that the eyes of the Lord are everywhere. And no matter what you do, no matter what you say, the Lord's going to see it, He's going to hear it, He's going to know about it. And the point is that only a fool will dare to take a position against God Himself. And the reason it's so foolish is because God will win every battle. He will know our every thought before we've even thought it. He is infinite, and in every category, He will win because He never sleeps. He never tires, and He can be everywhere at the same time. And all of those things are important to know for this reason. We don't want to make Him mad. We don't want to get into an argument with Him. And the best way to avoid getting into a foolish situation is to surrender immediately and obey even faster. So, how are we doing avoiding these foolish kind of battles against God? Probably the number one way that we're hurting ourselves is to refuse to obey Him. The problem is we've become an expert at doing so. We dismiss what He has told us in the Bible with, that's your interpretation. We spiritualize it away by claiming, well, that's in the Old Testament and we're now living under grace. We try to ignore His commands by stating, times have changed. But no matter how many excuses we use, we're always forced to return to the reality that God said it. And even though society has changed, God has not. I shared with our teenagers a couple of months ago that we all need to be very, very careful in how we behave in public, because we're now living in a world where what we think that we're doing in private can end up on YouTube. Smartphones can capture an embarrassing moment, put it on YouTube for the whole world to see. An individual can write something on Facebook, they think it's hilarious, they think it's funny, it's witty, and then they wonder why they just got fired from their job. Because more and more employers are checking out social media to find out what their employees are up to. There are some battles in life that just aren't worth it, because no matter what you do, you can't win. Verse number 4, third thing this morning that we need to avoid are needless casualties. Circle the word wholesome if you mark your Bible up. Verse 4, a wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness therein is a breach in the spirit. One of the most gruesome realities that came out of the Civil War was the fact that more people died from germs and infection and disease than died from bullets. Back then, they didn't even know what germs were. For that reason, surgeons would be spending hours sawing off limbs that were shattered by mini balls or cannonballs, and then they'd go from one patient to the next, and they were not even washing their hands. They were spreading infection ignorantly. For every 3 men killed on the battlefield, 5 more died from disease. During the Civil War, the state of Indiana lost 7,000 soldiers on the battlefield, and yet 17,000 more died from disease. People are going to die when there's a war. But boy, there's a difference from dying from a bullet or dying from diarrhea. One is expected and the other is totally unnecessary because it could be averted by simply washing your hands. Ill-spoken words are a lot like germs. Their effect on a person is almost invisible. Words can be spoken in anger, in a moment of weakness, and when the moment has passed, the person doing the speaking, boy, they feel so much better. They got it off their chest, and then they forget about what they have said. And yet that person who was spoken to can leave that battlefield of words, and those words are floating around in their heads, and then those words start digging in like an infection. And over time, those words can rot and spoil for days or weeks on end, and the longer that they remain, the more damage that they can bring. And then it happens. Solomon calls it a breach in the spirit. The Bible elsewhere calls it bitterness. You and I would probably call it a bad attitude. And when it arrives and fully manifests itself, it's already close to killing a person's spirituality. And unless that is dealt with quickly and with urgency, it will almost always bring about a slow, painful spiritual death that will progress sometimes over a course of years. The person infected was infected by nothing more than words spoken in haste, and yet they can become a casualty, and that could have been avoided. But how? The easiest way is for you and I to learn how to use the tongue to bring forth healing and health. Solomon calls that a wholesome tongue. It speaks words that are helpful, though sometimes painful. It speaks words from a heart that's filled with compassion, instead coming from a backslidden heart that's filled with bitterness. And there could be so many people salvaged in our church if we could simply learn how to bridle that tongue. Choose the words so carefully so that the words that are coming out are helpful and encouraging. Verse number 5. Fourth thing this morning is this: we need to avoid needless mistakes. A fool despiseth his father's instruction, but he that regardeth reproof is prudent. One of the things that causes a lot of grief in the lives of people who are getting older is that the older that a person gets, the easier it is to see a train wreck that's coming. Experience, which is a fancy word for saying mistakes. A person with experience can look at a younger person moving in a certain direction and they can see it coming. They know how it's going to end. And the problem is, for those who can see that train wreck that's coming and that tragedy that's about to come about, they would love to be able to share a word of warning, but for some reason, nobody's interested in hearing it. One of the more difficult relationships on earth is that between parent and child. Parents are not perfect. They've made their share of mistakes. And children are so anxious to explore life and to find out what the world is all about. And unfortunately, those are two entirely different worlds. A parent looks at the world as a place full of dangerous creatures that are lurking behind every corner, hiding under every rock. But a young person is looking at the world as if it's a huge playground that exists for their personal enjoyment. Bethany Stevens was 22 years old, lived in Virginia. She owned 2 pit bulls. Just the other day, she went out for a walk with her 2 pit bulls. When she did not return within a reasonable amount of time, her dad, wondering where's my daughter, went looking for her. He finally found her body out in the woods. She had been mauled to death by her 2 pet pit bulls. And people are thinking, but they're pets. They would never, ever turn on their owner. That, unfortunately, sums up what Solomon is here trying to get across to young people, and that is the necessity of listening to mom and dad. Yeah, puppies can be a lot of fun when they're little and playful. But there are certain breeds that can grow up and become hard to train, harder to manage, and too unpredictable to have around small children or owners that are incapable of dealing with them. And that is exactly what the world is all about. There are parts of this world that are drop-dead gorgeous. There are parts of this world that are beneficial and helpful. But there's also parts of it that are filled with people who are not so nice and situations that can potentially ruin you. And young people need to take their parents' words and advice to heart, because there are a lot of mistakes that can be avoided if you're fortunate enough to be around somebody who loves you enough to be honest with you concerning the truth. Take a look at verse number 6. Something else Solomon is encouraging all of us to avoid, and that is needless drama. Circle the word treasure in this verse. Verse 6, in the house of the righteous is much treasure, but in the revenues of the wicked is trouble. Because Solomon was the richest man in the world, anytime he happens to throw out a word like treasure, we kind of go to a default position and we think automatically, well, he's talking about money. That's a mistake to avoid. And here's the reason why. The word treasure in this verse does not mean money, it means strength. Yeah, money can become a source of strength in a lot of different ways. But what Solomon is here trying to help us understand is the fact that there are different kinds of strength that God blesses His people with other than just money. One way that God blesses His people is what I would call a boring life. Yes, that can be a blessing. The roof might leak, but it's an easy fix. The toilet might overflow once in a while, but a plunger will take care of it. There are no millionaires living under your roof, perhaps, but there's enough money in the bank to pay the bills and to help people in need and to enjoy life. The job is nothing like owning your own company or being the president, but it's good enough to be viewed as a blessing from God. And when you come home at the end of the day, there are people who are glad to see you and view you as a friend, as a loved one, and not as the enemy. And to a lot of people in this world, that probably sounds boring. And then there are those who hate organized religion. They hate the church. They view all Christians as being hypocrites, and they hate boring. And so they lie to get ahead, and they gossip about people so that they'll feel better about themselves, and they'll cheat on their spouses because life is supposed to be fun, and they spend their day at work hating every minute of it, dreaming of some other place where they'd rather be. They're up to their eyeballs in debt because they're trying to spend themselves into happiness, and at the end of the day, they might be surrounded by people, but they hate their life and those who are in it. They are miserable because they've tried to carve out a life for themselves minus God. And what do they have to show for their effort? Drama. Lots of drama. Solomon calls it the revenues of the wicked. It refers to pure trouble. And the word trouble means stirring the pot, roiling water. It points to a life that is constantly being agitated and stirred for the bad, and the reason is because that's all the flesh can do. It can stir the pot, but it cannot create anything that's worth having. Verse number 7, something else we need to avoid is a hard heart. Verse 7, the lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of the foolish doeth not so. The harsh world that we all live in is going to do one of two things to a person. It will either soften their heart with compassion and give them a desire to help others less fortunate, or this world will harden a person's heart and cause them to live for themselves with a lifelong motto of, it's every man for himself. Recently, my wife and I were visiting my parents in southern Indiana. My dad is 93. My mom is 91. I noticed that my mom was hobbling around a little bit more than normal, so I asked her what the problem was. She said that she had been to the doctor. He said, well, it's arthritis. And the doctor said, what that means is there's nothing you can do. His position is, hey, you're 91, what do you expect? And that's when I told her something that I'd shared with somebody in our church a number of months back, and that was one of the individuals in our church was telling me about they had pain in their hand, and arthritis getting bad and very, very painful. And I told this person, have you ever heard of taking fish oil? And you can go to the health food store, buy fish oil, and it kind of lubricates the joints. And this person got some, and their hand got better, and arthritis was not a problem. So I shared that with my mom. And I told her, I said, you need to, check into taking some fish oil. Her immediate question was, why didn't my doctor tell me that? You see, there's a lot of people in this world, if there's nothing in it for them, they're not going to disperse knowledge. If there's nothing to profit by, words could help somebody, but they might get ahead of us. So let's just be quiet. Solomon is saying, you know what? We need to be careful, because a hard heart is going to cause us to become so self-centered. All we think about is us. How can I get ahead? How can I make more? How can I be viewed as being better, smarter? And if we're not careful, this world will be allowed by us to become so hard-hearted when we see somebody that could be helped with something as free as our own words, and we choose to remain silent instead. Verse number 8. Last thing this morning is this: we need to avoid at all costs infuriating the Lord. Verse 8, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is His delight. The last thing this morning that we need to avoid big time is anything and everything that has to do with a phony religion. The sacrifice of the wicked is talking about something on a religious level a wicked person will do because that's what their religion calls for. The sacrifice of the wicked is referring to doing something that is religious but is sickening to God. Like what? Like getting baptized to wash away your sins? Only God can forgive sins, and yet a false religion will teach that baptism will do that, and that's a lie. One of the biggest religious upheavals in history took place when a former Catholic named Martin Luther chose to rebel against the Pope and the teachings of the Catholic Church. And what was the problem that Luther had with the Pope and the Catholic Church? The problem was they were selling forgiveness like Speedway sells gas. It was a moneymaker. It was a fundraiser. They were selling these indulgences. They could buy this, apply it to themselves, and for some money, their sins could be forgiven. And this former Catholic said, you know what? I don't like that. I think it's wrong. That is the kind of religious baloney that infuriates God, and it's a no-win situation when a person comes to this matter of salvation. God will always have the last word. And if a person is doing these religious things, God's not buying it. He's not going to put up with it. And Solomon feels so strongly about this, he's calling it the sacrifice of the wicked. Let's bow for prayer. Father, we're asking for your blessings to be upon this book of Proverbs. And Lord, I pray that you would use it in our lives to keep us out of trouble, to avoid so many heartaches. Holy Spirit, give us wisdom and discernment. Help us to have a hunger and a thirst for these so practical things that you've placed in the Bible for us. And dear God, I pray that you'd give us the wisdom this morning to be a spiritual recluse, to avoid things, situations, and even people that'll hurt us spiritually. For our walk with God ought to be the most precious thing in the heart of every Christian. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed. I wonder this morning if we have anybody who is not 100% sure that you're going to heaven when you die. There's that little 1% of doubt. every doubt concerning salvation ought to be investigated. This morning, if you slip your hand up, I'd like to pray for you in relation to your salvation. If you're not sure that you're saved right now, slip your hand up and we'd love to pray with you and for you. Anybody like that? All right, let's all stand. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed.